biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live, this is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me today here on Point of View. Hope you had a great weekend. We have a new president. He has hit the ground running, and a little bit later this hour, we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about the various executive orders that he has signed, the various campaign pledges that he has made, and he's been trying to fulfill today. We'll also talk about the fact that so far, you only had, as the other day, 2 of his cabinet appointees confirmed by the U.S. Senate, perhaps a third today, but let's compare that to Barack Obama 8 years ago, in which he had 8 on confirmation, actually on Inauguration Day, and then 2 more confirmed, so 10 that first week. So 10 compared to 2, you can see that there have been some attempts by Democrats to prolong and to even delay some of the confirmation hearings. So we'll get into that in just a minute. But I want to come back to an issue we talk about from time to time, and that is that instead of enrolling in an insurance policy, or of course we're just a week away from a time in which many of you might want to enroll in the Affordable Care Act, there is another opportunity, and that is something we've talked about before, because if you look at the Affordable Care Act, Section 1501 provides some exemptions, and one of those are for what are called health-sharing ministries. And in the past, we've talked about both Samaritan Ministries as well as Medishare, and because we had some questions about that the other day, and matter of fact, an individual sharing about her positive experience with that, I thought it would be good to come back and explain what that is, especially as some of you are trying to decide right now whether you would join with the Obamacare exchange or whether you might want to consider an alternative. Anthony Hopp is with us. He is the Vice President of External Relations at Samaritan Ministries International. Of course, one of the largest and most established healthcare sharing ministries in the country. 68,000 households so far participate through them, and it has been around for quite some time. Something that you would probably want to know a little bit more about, and for 22 years have provided their members with an opportunity to consider, if you will, a biblical alternative. So, Anthony, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Hello, Kerby. Very good to be with you today.
I have seen some of your videos, and certainly we have talked with other people at Samaritan's Ministries, and yet I think it is probably appropriate to just begin where everyone needs to start, and that is to recognize there are probably some listeners, even new radio stations that have joined us. So explain exactly what a healthcare sharing ministry is all about.
Sure. Well, the simplest way to think of it would be crowdfunding for healthcare. We are increasingly aware of ways to share other resources, whether it's transportation or lodging. And in healthcare sharing ministries, believers in Jesus Christ are coming together to share one another's medical bills directly, person to person, household to household, without using any insurance.
Well, and again, Galatians 6:2 talks about bearing one another's burdens so that you fulfill the law of Christ. And so I've had a number of people, Anthony, say, I would like to do this, one, because I think it might be more cost effective, 2, because, of course, it's allowed under the Affordable Care Act, and 3, because it's really biblical, because if you think about this, I would much rather join with like-minded Christians and not fund other people who are maybe damaging their body in one way or another through drugs, alcohol, sexual promiscuity. And so those are some pretty compelling reasons to look this over, aren't there?
Absolutely, Kerby. You know, usually the conversation starter for folks is cost, that people see their premiums skyrocketing, Often they have to increase their deductible just to be able to afford the premium. It's not uncommon for us to hear stories of people paying more for their premium than they do their mortgage. But very quickly, people realize that this is an option that is consistent with their values and their faith. They realize that healthcare sharing organizations are not paying for abortions. They're not paying for gender reassignment surgery. So they're excited about that component. They're also own healthcare without a third. And then finally, the community aspect is enormous as well, where people realize that, yes, it's important to share the financial burden, but so much more happens around that because members are also praying for each other and sending cards and notes of encouragement.
Let's talk about that for just a minute because, again, some people don't understand it. We're talking about 68,000 member households, about 221,000 individuals, all 50 states worldwide. You send your monthly financial share directly to that member household who has those medical needs, but then you also can pray for one another. You can include cards and notes of encouragement. Talk about how that actually develops.
Well, every single month as a member, I receive the name of another Samaritan member, and I send my share directly to that person. This month for our family, it was a precious 3-year-old girl who has a brain tumor. A lot of times it's not that serious, but it certainly can be with 68,000 households. And so I'm not only writing a check directly to this family, but I'm including a card or note. The community really can't be overstated. A recent example was we had a family who experienced their baby dying after only 12 days. There was a severe chromosomal problem, and Isley is the little girl's name, and the parents, Sarah and Tanner, were obviously completely wrecked over this, and Sarah had later told us as she was talking with our member advocates that at this point she was really struggling with her faith, understandably, and one night in despair as she was driving, she cries out to the Lord and prays, "Why do you feel so far away? And if you love me and hear my prayers, would you please send me a sign to let me know you're near?" Well, when Sarah got home, she pulls into her driveway, goes to the mailbox, and there's a note from a Samaritan member with a cross-stitched cloth that had Isley's name on it and a flower. So that's just representative of what's happening every single month across the country with the 68,000 households.
Let me just mention that we have a link to SamaritanMinistries.org, and of course you'll have a number in just a minute, but what you are doing right now, if I've got my numbers correct, are sharing more than $23 million each month, and yet the monthly share for an individual is pretty much less than $500, isn't it?
That's right. For a family of any size, it's $495, and we should underscore that discussion with the fact that by God's grace, 4 out of the last 5 months, we've actually seen a share reduction, meaning that there were enough shares to go around to meet 100% of the medical needs that were presented. So as an example, just this past month in January, all 68,000 households paid 7% less just for that month, which obviously is unheard of when you consider healthcare costs across the board.
Let's take a break. When we come back, obviously want to ask the tough questions, the ones that probably are occurring to you, and that is, okay, what if I get cancer, and what can actually take place in that particular set of circumstances, and what's kind of the maximum in terms of medical need? Then we'll also talk about this idea of save to share, which is part of that, which would then provide more than that. So we'll get into some of those specifics. But if you find yourself saying, well, pretty soon here I have to do something in terms of our insurance, and especially with the deadline about a week away for the Affordable Care Act, or known as Obamacare, I know some of you are saying, I don't really like what that plan is, and I don't really like funding other people's lifestyles. I'd really love to gather together with fellow believers, but I've got some questions, so we'll come back and ask a few of those questions of Anthony, and again, direct you to their website, SamaritanMinistries.org. We'll also give you a phone number and all of that coming up right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
You know, all of a sudden, deficits matter now that we have a new president and a new administration. That's about the only conclusion you can come to with the radical change in perspective from New York Times columnist Paul Krugman. Kevin Williamson, in a recent column, reminds us what columnist and Nobel Prize-winning economist Paul Krugman wrote back in October. He said that future President Hillary Clinton should ignore people worried about deficits and the national debt and engage in years of deficit finance infrastructure spending if she can. A little over 2 months later, Paul Krugman wrote that deficits matter again. His argument is that the unemployment numbers and wage figures suggest that we have returned to full employment so that we don't need the emergency measures he advocated a few weeks before the election. Of course, those numbers aren't that different today than they were in October. The real reason is that deficits and the debt don't matter unless you're a Republican president. Actually, they do matter regardless of who is in the White House and which party controls Congress. You can find newspaper columns I wrote about this when Ronald Reagan, George Herbert Walker Bush, and Bill Clinton were president. You can even find viewpoints commentaries I've written and recorded when George W. Bush and Barack Obama were president. Let's look at these last two presidents. When Bush came into office, the federal deficit was more than $5 trillion. When he left office and when President Obama took office, it was more than $10 trillion. And the federal debt today is almost $20 trillion. And if you want to blame Congress, both parties are to blame. During that time, Republicans controlled Congress some of the time, and Democrats controlled Congress at other times. So I welcome columnists who believe that deficits and the debt are important. I just wonder where they were when President Obama and Congress were running up more than $9 trillion in national debt. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For more information about issues covered on Viewpoints, visit pointofview.net. Pointofview.net.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Anthony Hopp with us for just a few more minutes, Vice President of External Affairs for Samaritan Ministries International. We have a link to samaritansministries.org. You can find it on our website, pointofview.net. And Anthony, let's, if we can, first of all, biblically, again, Acts 2 talks about taking care of each other. Galatians 6:2 talks about bearing one another's burdens. There's certainly a lot of scriptural admonition. But I guess the question, sort of a practical one, which I know you've addressed as well, has to do with what about those really expensive kinds of situations? And it is something that you are asked quite frequently, and you do have a maximum amount that is available, but then you even have where various members can actually be part of what's called Save to Share. But talk about what happens if somebody gets a long, debilitating disease that is much more expensive than the typical kind of medical expense.
Yeah, well, we share those the same way we would share something smaller. So whether a member has to get stitched up or whether they had a long, extraordinary cancer need, the process is exactly the same. And the narrative has been that God has been so faithful, and by His grace over the 22 years, there's never been a medical need that has been too much. We've had a couple dozen of medical needs that have gone over $1 million, and every single one has been shared. You mentioned Save to Share, Kerby, and that's an optional program for those catastrophic medical needs that exceed $250,000. Our first step of action is to negotiate reductions. If there's any bright spot in having such a large medical need, it's that typically the larger the bill, the bigger discount can be had. So that helps considerably. But then even after that, Samaritan members come together and they share in those expenses as well. And so Save to Share has been a great tool, and the Lord has used it in order to meet even those extraordinarily large medical bills.
So again, talk about what are some of the limits, if any, to those kinds of situations, because you've had situations where people have had an aggressive brain cancer, where individuals have actually had to deal with some pretty significant medical needs. And you mentioned something just in passing that I'd love to have you talk a little bit more about. Well, this might be the first time that somebody might actually feel like they have an advocate that can maybe renegotiate some of those bills that, as we've all received over the years from hospitals, seem rather outrageous when they charge you, very high dollar amounts for some things that I could probably get at the grocery store or the drugstore for a whole lot less.
Oh, you're right. Yeah, there's practically zero price transparency, which I don't know that we would tolerate in many other industries. I can't imagine going to a restaurant and ordering my meal and not knowing what it costs and being brought a bill at the end of it. But that's precisely what happens when we purchase health care. Back to your initial question of limits, and when a member is enrolled in Save to Share as a part of this optional program,
right,
there are no limits. It's based on how many shares are available, and currently, for the last few years, it's been holding steady at about $17 or $18 million.
Wow!
And that's not Samaritan money. That is members who have said, "I'm in Save to Share and I'm ready to go if there's a large medical need." And then to the point of negotiating reductions, as most people are probably aware, the billing is usually 3 to 5 times they call it the charge master rate, and so there's no reason at all that self-pay patients should be paying the full amount. And so, exactly as you say, Kerby, we're able to go in as an advocate with and for the member and negotiate reductions on their behalf, and usually to the tune of between 45 and 50%. Our members will still pay slightly more than they would through reasonable and customary agreements. But the great benefit here is that members are still directing their own health care. We're still sharing those amounts that aren't discounted, but our members are working hard to keep the costs down. They're being wise consumers and really balancing the idea of, yes, they have the liberty to choose their own doctors, but they're responsible and being good consumers at the same time.
Talking with Anthony Hopp, and again, he is with Samaritan Ministries. Anthony, just before we go, let's, if we can, first of all, direct people to the website, but if people have other questions and would like to talk to you off air, because I know each person's questions oftentimes are very specific and they need maybe specific answers to some of those, or if they are interested in signing up, where do we go and how do we direct them in the right places?
Certainly. The website is Samaritan Ministries. Samaritan is singular, Ministries is plural, .org, SamaritanMinistries.org, and our phone number is 877-764-2426. We have plenty of staff who are eager and ready to speak with prospective members and even spend some time walking through personal situations and scenarios, answering the questions. We understand it's a paradigm shift. It's a whole different animal, and so our staff does a great job of patiently walking through all the what-ifs and answering the questions and helping make that transition from insurance to healthcare sharing, which, by the way, when members do, their only comment is, "I wish I had done this sooner."
Yes. And again, the numbers are increasing almost every time I have a chance to interview you or, of course, Medishare. And so that's an encouragement as well. And I think, again, a very biblical way of dealing with some of the health issues that all of us have to face from time to time. So, Anthony, I appreciate the good work that you do there, and just encourage people to go to our website or directly to SamaritanMinistries.org and to find out a little bit more. So thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Thank you, Kerby. My pleasure.
Well, again, let me encourage you to find out a little bit more. As we've said, the deadline coming up fairly soon here to actually be part of the Affordable Care Act. And you know what? I think this is a much better way. So again, the enrollment deadline was another reason why we wanted to talk about it today. And also because we've had some of you ask about this. And so from time to time, we like to tell you about the opportunity that exists. And it may not always exist, but certainly right now, Section 1501 in the Affordable Care Act does allow for a couple of different exemptions. There is a religious conscience exemption that really affects people like Old Order, Amish, and Mennonite and things of that nature. There's an exemption for members of Indian tribes because they might already be part of the Indian health care system. That doesn't affect most of us. But if you're a Christian, the one that certainly could affect you is that there is an opportunity to actually join with one of these health sharing ministries. As I understand, there's really only 3 of those, and we've talked about one today and mentioned the other one, MediShare. I might also mention Christian Health Ministries Care. And so those exist, and I think are a great alternative for a number of reasons. First of all, of course, price, but also just the opportunity to begin to be the body of Christ to help one another. So we're going to take a break in just a minute. Let me mention again something that I won't come back to probably until later this week, but just very disturbing that when 8 years ago, President Barack Obama wanted to actually begin to implement his policies, he had, by the day after his inauguration, 10 of his cabinet officers in place. That makes it pretty easy to begin to implement everything that you want to implement. Donald Trump actually had 2 Trump nominees actually confirmed on Inauguration Day. That would be James Mattis as the Secretary of Defense and John Kelly as the Secretary of Homeland Security. I understand that probably today we'll have Mike Pompeo confirmed as CIA director, although that vote was supposed to take place on Friday, but the Democrats objected and delayed. And of course, because of these objections, we have the situation that has happened right now. Only 2 cabinet secretaries confirmed over the weekend, and that's the lowest number in decades. A sharp contrast, as I pointed out, with, of course, President Barack Obama. And if really you just look over the last 6 presidents, according to the Daily Signal, they had an average of 10 cabinet secretaries confirmed their first week in office. President Bill Clinton had the most with 13. President George Herbert Walker Bush had 2 confirmed, but that's because you had a couple of others that were actually staying on under the Reagan administration. So no president, at least in the last few decades, has actually been in office and had to wait for the Senate to confirm his, or eventually we might even have a her, the various nominees that are put forward. So this is going to make something a little more difficult for the Trump administration, and it's something to pay attention to. When we come back, though, this is a president that has hit the ground running. So we're going to talk about some of the executive orders that he has signed and the impact that that might have. And if you'd like to join our conversation, perhaps you have comments about the inauguration, comments about the Women's March over the weekend, comments about some of these confirmations, or, as we'll talk about in just a minute, any comments about some of these executive orders, we'd love to hear from you. 1-800-351-1212. Go to the website. You can find out a little bit more about Samaritan Ministries. And, of course, don't forget, we're still encouraging you to click on that banner that allows you to get a brochure, since, after all, we're going to have a cruise to Alaska in August, and we would certainly want you to join with us. Let's take a break. And if you'd like to join the conversation at any point, 1-800-351-1212. We'll be back with more right after this.
Recently, I've been struggling through a case of what I call the cruds. Pretty common thing for most of us, but if you think about it, not a good thing for those who depend on our voice as part of our work. Kind of like someone who writes for a living suffering broken fingers. But we press on. We do the best we can as God provides, right? Well, that's what I'm asking you to do today. Not to feel guilty or stressed about what you can't do, but to step up and do what you can to support the Truth Team at Point of View. We'd love it if everyone could give $100 a month. If even a small percentage did that, we could greatly expand our impact. Or $65 to underwrite a minute each month. But for many, $1 a day, $30 is a stretch. As God provides, do what you can and help us change the future through changing minds and hearts 1 month at a time. Give online at pointofview.net or using the Point of View radio app. pointofview.net, or call 800-347-5151, 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, is Kerby Anderson.
I'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Let's go first to the state of Georgia on the Good News Network. Nathan, thank you for joining our conversation today.
Thank you for having me. I was, over the weekend, my wife was talking about the Women's March, and And one of the things that she showed me was a picture of 4 women that had these genitalia costumes on walking around, and I thought it was very vulgar to have such a thing out in open. And one of the questions that I had was if a male happened to do that, he would more than likely be arrested for that. And it seems to me that we've got a double standard in this nation when it comes to such things as that, as trying to be, trying to voice your opinion about certain things. But I noticed that when you dealing with anything with Hollywood, that they're just about taking everything that has to do with God out of the nation. And if you think about the nation as the game Jenga, at the very bottom, you've got God, and you've got the marriage, and you've got the church. And what Hollywood and most of the leftists have done is taken out God. And if you know anything about the game Jenga, once you mess with the bottom foundation,
there it goes.
You run into the issue of the whole thing collapsing. Now I can see that happening because we've already taken God out of schools. You can't do any kind of prayers or anything, and not to mention that now we've basically destroyed what marriage is in the eyes of God, and it gets frustrating to me as a father, but what my son's going to see coming up in his future, what the nation's really going to look like.
And think about role models. You're talking about your sons, but think about the women. I mean, you're talking about these women wearing those costumes, but then think about what was said. And I just thought twice about whether we wanted to even play any of the things that Ashley Judd, actress, said, or Madonna said. And if, some of your role models are singers like Madonna or actresses like Ashley Judd, we're in a bad way real fast, aren't we? Because I can't even repeat on the air some of the things that they said, nor would I want to.
One of the things I wanted to bring up, too, is you can check out any of these videos, and what we're teaching these young lady children to be is amazing, that we're getting away with it. And they look to athletes as far as being role models for children, and they constantly get on these football players, basketball players, about being role models to our sons, but we don't hold the same standards for some of these young female actresses that get up there and basically destroy the church and what God in the Bible says. And for me, I'm grateful now. I mean, it would have been nice to have a daughter, but seeing the way things are going and what the young girls are being taught now, it scares me just for my son, what he's going to have to go through.
Yes. Well, again, Nathan, I appreciate you starting us off. I mean, you really identified some of the concerns that surfaced, and I don't think that we've seen the end of this. I mean, recognize, and our next caller wants to talk about some of the riots and the demonstrations. This is all happening before President Trump has done much of anything, although in just a few minutes I will give you a long list, because it's a pretty significant list of all the executive orders that he signed, either a few kind of perfunctory ones on Friday, but then all sorts of ones today. Wait till some of this actually becomes reality and isn't just speculation. I think we're in for the kind of tumult and kind of controversy that some of us experienced, some of us are older, in the 1960s. So we'll see. So, Nathan, thank you for your phone call. It was a great one, and I appreciate you starting us off there. Let's go to Tom. I think he wants to add to that and talk not so much about the Women's March, but some of those demonstrations and the riots. What are your thoughts?
Well, the Women's March and the demonstrations as well. It was kind of interesting. Last night I was watching National Geographic, and it had a segment on there about Hitler. And after the segment on Hitler, it had After Hitler, and it had 2 parts. And in each one of these parts, it talked about the effects of the Second World War and what the Germans did with the Jews in the rest of Eastern Europe. And what was interesting about it is that these people were doing some of the same things that we see these rioters and these demonstrators doing now. And there didn't seem to be any values or anything like that, holding them back from doing anything they wanted to.
Yeah, again, just think about the fact that the two organizations certainly that were very supportive of Hillary Clinton would be Starbucks and Bank of America. Those were the two institutions that were destroyed first in those riots. I mean, I'm laughing because I'm really sad about it, but I mean, it is just ironic that it wasn't like they were even targeting some of the deplorables, to use a phrase that at least one candidate used. They were actually, in some cases, destroying the very institutions that would agree with some of the views of those that were throwing the rocks or breaking the windows. It just shows you that this is more anarchy. This is almost like the anarchists of the early part of the 20th century in America or in Europe than it is even Nazis. But again, this is the world we live in right now. The one side says that Adolf Hitler is Hitler. The other side saying, well, these rioters look like Hitler. The one side has fake news. The other side has, what's the latest one? Alternative facts. We're going to have to try to get some truth in the midst of all this insanity. That's as a talk show host, I always have something to talk about. That's for sure.
That's the truth. Now, Stalin came in and he used the Communist Party to take over the governments of those other states that he wanted to, become the controller of, and they used the same scenario that we're seeing now. They had the riots and they had the demonstrations, and it was almost like a forced change in the government. Those people in leadership that were Democrats, they had to leave the country or be killed.
Well, let's hope we don't have that. I'm just hoping we don't have that. I mean, we lived through the 1960s, the days of rage and things of that nature, and certainly we'll see how that plays itself out. But, Tom, I appreciate your phone call because I did want to, just before we take our next break, get into a couple of issues, and that is real quickly, before I take some more calls, the fact that this has been something that has been planned for some time by the now incoming Trump administration. He may not have much of his cabinet established and confirmed yet, but they have been planning all sorts of actions on immigration and trade. They also have a chance to kind of lay the groundwork for a trade deal because on Friday, President Trump will be meeting with the British Prime Minister, Theresa May. That'll be actually the first foreign leader to visit the new president in the White House. He also today is meeting with some of the congressional leaders, and I'll come back to that in just a minute. And so this is going to be part of it, and he'll actually be part of the lawmakers' retreat later in the week. So we'll see how that plays it out. But let me just real quickly, because we're going to a break, and then if you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. We'll take them after the break. But real quickly, we have today President Donald Trump signing an executive order stating that it's his intention to renegotiate the free trade agreement between the United States, Canada, and Mexico, and this is known as NAFTA. It's the North American Free Trade Agreement. It was crafted back in 1994 by then President Bill Clinton, and it has been something that he says he has wanted to renegotiate. And even those who are fearful, and there's reason to be, about kind of this isolationist or protectionist philosophy, I think could at least agree that what you have is a treaty that was signed in 1994, and now it's a few years later, isn't it? Yes. And so I think after almost a quarter of a century, it's probably worth looking at that again. So we'll see how that plays itself out. Also, he says that he wants to formally abandon the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which would mean pulling away from Asia and actually scrapping President Barack Obama's most significant trade deal. And so that is another action that is taking place today, although many of these just start the process. It's not like signing some of these actually begin. Then also has signed an executive order putting a freeze on hiring and also a freeze on wage increases for some federal government workers. And this is, again, fulfilling one of his campaign promises. The hiring freeze, I might mention, excludes military and national security employees. And so we'll look at how that plays itself out. Then another one, he has signed an executive order which would defund international Planned Parenthood. This is part of what is oftentimes referred to as the Mexico City policy, which has been implemented really since 1984 by Ronald Reagan, but then abandoned by President Clinton and President Obama. So he's reinstating this, and this, of course, would only affect the international Planned Parenthood, but of course then a number of others are waiting for Congress to pass a bill that would defund Planned Parenthood here in the country, and so we'll get into that as well. Need to take a break. I'll come back and talk about some of the other actions. It has already been a very busy day for the incoming president, and it will be one that will generate more of the controversy we've talked about with Nathan and Tom. If you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212.
Welcome to the First Liberty Briefing. I'm Jeremy Dice. After World War II, soldiers from the Army's 10th Mountain Division sought to honor their fallen brothers who were lost while fighting in some of the roughest terrain in Europe. The memorial is a 6-foot-tall figure of Jesus in the style of religious shrines they had seen on battlefields in Europe. The Knights of Columbus in Kalispell, Montana erected this Veterans Memorial known casually as Big Mountain Jesus. It stood without complaint for more than 60 years atop Big Mountain in the Flathead National Forest. One group wanted to knock the memorial down. They sued the U.S. Forest Service for permitting its presence on top of Big Mountain. First Liberty Institute filed a friend of the court brief on behalf of the state of Montana and the roughly 2.4 million members of the American Legion. We asked the court to preserve the 10th Mountain Division Veterans Memorial. The United States Court of Appeals for the Ninth Circuit held that the memorial is constitutional. The court explained that the Constitution does not require the government to purge cultural or historic symbols from the public square merely because they are religious. Veterans should be given wide latitude in determining how they choose to honor their fallen brothers in arms. And if these veterans choose religious symbolism as part of their memorials, the government's response should be one of respectful neutrality. To learn how First Liberty is protecting religious liberty for all Americans, visit firstliberty.org.
I'm Kelly Shackelford, President and Chief Counsel of First Liberty Institute. Some people think our religious freedom will soon be gone, but that's not true. The fact is that First Liberty, a national network of America's top attorneys, is winning over 90% of our cases. We defend religious freedom for people like you. Go to firstliberty.org and read the exciting story. That's firstliberty.org.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
If you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Let's head out to California this time, listening on KYCC. Sharon, thank you for sharing a little bit more of what happened in D.C. I understand you had a friend that went there.
Yes, she had explained on Facebook that she had gone there with her 2 children, and they were adults, and her son had a hat that said Trump on it, and was mobbed by all these women and using profanity. She said that even small children were holding signs up with body parts on them, and some of them said, gay rights matter, black lives matter, and she yelled at them because, they were going after her children, and she said, yeah, and unborn babies matter too,
Good line. Yeah.
and and thank God that they got out of there very safe, but it's like, what happened to our rights, of what we believe in and stuff. And so, yeah, I just wanted to make that comment about what she had gone through, and she got home safe, thank God.
One of the videos that has gone viral is a woman that just kind of comes unglued on an airplane. I believe it was on Alaska Airlines, against this one individual that said he was excited about the Trump inauguration, and she just goes nuts. And so finally they have to take her and her husband off the plane. And of course, you can see some of the things she's saying, and then you can see the husband having to take the stuff from their overhead compartment off, and you can see, like, I've had to deal with this for a long time. Wow. And so, sometimes it's one thing to hear it, it's another thing to see it and go, I mean, there is a sense in which the other side, and I mean that in a charitable sense, because, I mean, some individuals were marching and they were responsible, but some of these individuals are just doing all they can, not only to become unglued, but also to lose America. Because I've said what happens so often in some of these debates, let's take since it was just, Sanctity of Life Sunday yesterday, the pro-life debate and the pro-choice debate. In the past, sometimes what you would see is middle America would watch some of these pro-lifers that were really just unglued themselves and strident and all this, and they'd be saying things to people on the other side who were oftentimes very rowdy and unglued as well. And in middle America said, even though I tend to really be pro-life, I can't really relate to either of these. And I think the pro-life movement over the years has realized, we need to be very gracious and loving and kind. And of course, in most cases they have, but in some cases you've had some spokespeople that maybe weren't so effective. And what happens is that in some of these debates, most of America, they don't really necessarily believe strongly about one issue or another. But I think when they see this women's march over the weekend, they see the rioting, they see the demonstrations, they hear the profanity, they see the vulgar appearances. Most of middle America goes, boy, even if they have a good idea or two, even if I sometimes might even agree with some of their policies, I'm just repulsed by that. And so I think this is what's going to really backfire on those kind of secular progressives out there that think that by doing this, they're going to turn the nation around. And actually, they're going to turn the nation off to many of their ideas simply because of the way they're behaving these days.
Exactly. Yeah, she was just, glad that she got out of there. And sometimes, it's hard to keep your composure when you're mobbed by all these people, and I'm just glad she and her children got out of there safe, and like you said, it's horrible what's going on. You finally realize how much evil really is out there and how they're oblivious to, God's grace,
we can kind of roll our eyes when we hear about the snowflakes and the crying and I need my chocolate and my hot chocolate and I need my therapy dogs and I need my crayons and all that. But then now it's starting to move away from sadness to anger, from sort of denial to real kind of intense hatred that is beginning to be unleashed, and also in such a vulgar and profane way that if this is a preview of coming attractions, I think all of us are going to say, when are we going to be able to turn America around? Because these demonstrations over the weekend in Washington, D.C. and other parts of the country are not what they're supposed to be peaceful demonstrations, and they haven't turned out quite that way. And I recognize that in some cases this may just be a few and not the majority. The reality is some of those few were on the podium saying some of these things, and so we'll see how this plays itself out. Whereas before, the mainstream press did all it could to try to make it look like the Tea Party people that were demonstrating were a bunch of radicals. Yet after they finished one of their marches, they said, the Park Service said this is probably the cleanest we've ever seen the Washington Mall. It didn't quite look like that after some of the other groups on the other side actually took over the Washington Mall. So we'll see how this plays out over the next couple of weeks. But like I said, if this is the kind of reaction we're getting now in the inauguration, where all of this is hypothetical, what happens when the Trump administration does some of the things that it promised to do, at least Donald Trump promised to do during the campaign? I think we're going to see a lot more of this, not less.
Exactly. Well, thank you so much for taking my call, Kerby, and God bless you.
Well, thank you. Let's, if we can, just mention that in the second hour, we're going to get into talking about presidents a little bit. Larry Schweikart's going to be with us. He's written a couple of books, The Politically Incorrect Guide to the Presidents, also one on why Trump won, so we're going to have some time to chat with him. But also, this is another area, just before we run out of time, that I wanted to mention, and we'll have more time over the week. Matter of fact, there's going to be 4 years of a Trump administration, so there'll be lots of time to talk about this, but this is going to be one of the interesting areas of conflict potentially between Donald Trump and some of the Republican leadership, because many people believe there's going to be a bit of a fight because the Trump officials, that is those in the cabinet or those who will be in the cabinet, have already been combing through various budgets to find ways to save money. They want to get rid of waste, fraud, and abuse. And so there is going to be a real attempt to try to significantly cut spending. That is, again, one of the promises that Donald Trump has made. It is certainly one of the promises that his Vice President Mike Pence has reiterated. And so we're going to perhaps even this weekend and later this week, I guess I should say, because I guess it is during the week, when there is a time in which the president is going to get together with some of the lawmakers at their retreat, discuss this legislative agenda. And part of that is to really cut the size and scope of the government. He didn't necessarily run on cutting back the government, but he did run on the idea of cutting waste, fraud, and abuse. And so I do believe that that's going to be pretty significant, and that might be the first place where you start seeing a conflict between the Trump administration and some of those that are establishment individuals, both Republicans and Democrats. So let's see if we can get in one more phone call real quickly, because we're getting close on time. But Susan in South Carolina, you have the floor. We only have about a minute. What would you like to say?
Well, I just wanted to add about the Women's March. I wouldn't really call it that. Because they would not allow the pro-life women to march with them. And how can that be a true women's march?
And one of the things I've appreciated about some of our pro-life leaders is they have pointed out how many of the leaders of the women's suffrage movement and those who actually were part of the original, if you will, women's movement, even at the turn of the century, to a woman, they were almost all pro-life. So today, this sort of modern feminist movement has been anything but pro-life. And so if you think about it, half of the individuals that aborted, what are we up to? 58 million abortions. Half of those were young girls in the womb. So good point. And again, it was a woman's march, but if you were a pro-life woman, even if you were a pro-life feminist, you had to stay home because we would not allow you to go to that particular march. Susan, thank you so much. We need to take a break. We're going to come back and talk a little bit more about the presidents. We're going to learn a little history, but also learn from Larry a little bit about how is it that Donald Trump ended up being president. So we've got a lot to cover with him. And if you'd like to learn a little bit more about some of the issues that we're going to be talking about today, we've posted them on our website, pointofview.net. Take the time to read them. Maybe hit that share button, put them on your Facebook page, start a conversation, and we'll be having this conversation all through these next few years. We'll be back right after this.
Why does Kerby Anderson do what he does? Because he believes in God's ability to use you to make a difference.
There's a real need for us to articulate a responsible biblical perspective and to give people an understanding of what is happening in the world, and in addition to educating them, to then empower them to go out and make a difference for Christ.
Together we can push back the growing darkness. It's not going to be easy, but by God's grace, it is happening one person, one community at a time. Join us in this mission. Become a monthly partner. $1 a day, $30 a month will make a huge difference. Or perhaps you can do $100 a month. We need partners of all sizes. We need you. Give today online at pointofview.net. At the top of the page, next to the Donate Now button, click on Become a Monthly Partner. Pointofview.net. Mail your donation to Point of View, Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221, or call 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
I just thank God for y'all. I listen to you every day, truly. I wanted to thank y'all for everything you do each day to inform Christian families and our community about the things we can do, and just the way you're so informative. I listen to you daily and love you guys and appreciate you so much.
God bless you, Kerby, for keeping this show so on track and for the decades of wonderful help to this nation that Point of View has been. We're all big fans of your work, and we pray that God will just prosper it.
As a Christian, over the years that I've followed this program, I am constantly challenged to be on guard and to evaluate what's going on. And if for no other reason, to protect the caliber and the truth of your programming, I need to participate and to back your program financially to ensure that the truth stays out there for people to hear, to view, and to be a part of.
This is Point of View Radio.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Since we have a new president, I thought it would be good for us to learn a little bit more about past presidents, but also talk a little bit about how this president actually came to be. So we're going to be talking today with Larry Schweikart about the Politically Incorrect Guide to Presidents, and we'll look at that. I might also mention he's a co-author of a book called How Trump Won. We might get to that later, but certainly the book that we have posted on our website is this one. Of course, you're very familiar with all the politically incorrect guides that we've used over the years. There's been so many on everything from American history and the Bible to capitalism and the Constitution to global warming and even such issues as jihad and Islam and much, much more. This is one of that series, and it's extremely well written by an individual who's been on the program with us before. Dr. Larry Schweikart is an individual that received his bachelor's degree in political science when he went to Arizona State University, got a master's degree there, and then a PhD from the University of California at Santa Barbara, was a professor for many years at the University of Dayton, and we've talked about him with some of his books, 7 Events That Made America, Patriots' History of the United States, and of course this new book, A Politically Incorrect Guide to the Presidents. And Larry, thank you for joining us once again here on Point of View.
Sure thing, Kerby. Good to be here.
You know, we just had an inauguration of the president, and you spent a little bit of time talking about that. I mean, the first inauguration was not in Washington, D.C. It was in New York City in 1789, and that is George Washington, who in your book you say was a man who didn't need the job, which might have been, maybe should be a prerequisite for our presidents. But nevertheless, even then, it was a place where you had ceremonial artillery and church bells and all the rest. So even at the very beginning, we recognize the value of an inauguration. Of course, then later Thomas Jefferson rode from the Capitol to the White House, and that was the beginning of inaugural parade. So what took place on Friday is not atypical of anything. It goes all the way back to some of our first presidents, doesn't it?
Right. These guys all understood that even though the Electoral College had elected them, the Electoral College was the voice of the people, and it was important that they show themselves to the people on a regular basis. One of the interesting things I found about George Washington was that right after he got in office, he began holding these little, I think they were Wednesday or Thursday. I can't remember, they were Wednesday or Thursday afternoon meetings, because Martha would do one, I think, on Friday. And these had gone for about 2 to 3 hours in the afternoon. And a limited number of men, between 15 and 20 local men, would be brought in. I guess they had a lottery, or I don't know how they selected who got in. Yeah. But they would come in and they would form a semicircle around Washington, and he would stand with his back at the fireplace, which I'm sure during the winter months was the best place in the room.
Probably.
And then he would go around and introduce himself and speak briefly with every single one of these people, and they would do that every week. So right off the bat, this was not a king. This was someone who was accessible to the people. Maybe not every person, maybe not the lowest person on the totem pole, but clearly accessible to the people, and I think that was important from our get-go.
Well, and again, there's one other thing about George Washington that's pretty amazing, and that is we had our first re-election, and some people wondered, including the King of England, whether or not George Washington would actually retire. Are we just going to end up with another king in America? And there's something about an individual that didn't need the job, probably did it only with some reluctance, was willing to serve 4 years, get reelected 4 more years, and then go back to Mount Vernon. And that established a very important precedent, which today we take for granted, but was pretty much unheard of in the 18th century, wasn't it?
It was very important. And the fact that he stood for reelection when he very much wanted to go home. And by the way, this is a sentiment held by many, many presidents. They viewed this as a service. They couldn't wait to go home. I can't tell you how many quotes are in the book of some guys, man, I can't wait till my term's over. I want to go home. But Washington,
yeah. How has it changed? Well, air conditioning. I think William Carey changed that. Once they had air conditioning in Washington, D.C., then they were willing to stay there a little bit longer. But go ahead.
Well, but Washington thought it was important for the nation that he stand for re-election, which was not unanimous. His first election was unanimous, second wasn't. But he thought it was very important that he stand for re-election because he didn't think the nation yet was quite stable enough to perhaps hand off power even to John Adams. But then after 2 terms, he thought just the opposite. He said, I do not want to be in a position where I am reelected to a 3rd term, die in office, because he was very conscious of his mortality, and then have John Adams accede to the presidency through a death. He wanted to make sure that when he stepped down, that there was another free and fair election. As you point out, this is absolutely unheard of any place in the world.
Well, since we mentioned John Adams, let's talk about, of course, John Adams serves 4 years, but then the Adams-Jefferson election in 1800. One of the things, Larry, I like to say from time to time is if you think the last election was contentious, you just need to go back and look at our first really contested election in 1800. The kinds of things that the patrons of John Adams said about Thomas Jefferson and the kind of supporters of Thomas Jefferson said about John Adams, that also set a stage for the kind of contentious election we just had just a few months ago.
Absolutely. People who think that we're at some new low, and maybe in some ways we are, but in most ways this has been going on since the beginning, people calling each other names, people warning of the direst consequences if the other guy gets elected. And by the way, Abigail Adams was no fan of Jefferson. She really detested him. But I have said in Patriots history, and I say again in this book, that the election of 1800 was the most important election in American history, because it's an election where you not just change people. You're not just changing one Federalist for another. You're changing a Federalist for their arch enemies, the Republicans, who had 180 degrees opposite views of how to conduct government, of everything. And so it was a true test of democracy. And actually, Fox mentioned this the day before the inauguration, and I was a little surprised that they actually got this, because I've not heard too many people dwell on what a critically important election 1800 was. And then there's one last thing we ought to mention, is that back then there was a price to be paid if you lied about somebody in public. You could be called out for a duel, as Alexander Hamilton found out.
Alexander Hamilton, of course, that's Aaron Burr as well. We'll come back and spend a little more time talking about some of the presidents and helping us understand some of the traditions that we have, and also certainly some of the ideas that were important in our history. So we certainly wanted to cover that. But again, Larry has also been a part of a book called How Trump Won. So we're going to get into that as well. And I think all of this will help us not only understand our history, but even help us put some of this in context. And just as he was saying, he was thrilled that Fox got it right. I'm thinking, yeah, I wish a lot more people in some of the other areas of media. Matter of fact, I wish a lot of history professors would read some of his material. Maybe they'd get it right, too. But we need to take a break. If you'd like to join our conversation at any point, we're privileged to have with us today Larry Schweikart. And again, we've mentioned a few of his books, The Patriot History of the United States, 7 Events That Made America. Of course, this one, which we're talking about now, The Politically Incorrect Guide to the Presidents. A little bit later, why did Donald Trump win? There were some people that thought it was quite possible. Most didn't. And here is where we are today in the first full day of the Trump administration. We'll be back right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
You know, all of a sudden, deficits matter now that we have a new president and a new administration. That's about the only conclusion you can come to with the radical change in perspective from New York Times columnist Paul Krugman. Kevin Williamson, in a recent column, reminds us what columnist and Nobel Prize-winning economist Paul Krugman wrote back in October. He said that future President Hillary Clinton should ignore people worried about deficits and the national debt and engage in years of deficit finance infrastructure spending if she can. A little over 2 months later, Paul Krugman wrote that deficits matter again. His argument is that the unemployment numbers and wage figures suggest that we have returned to full employment so that we don't need the emergency measures he advocated a few weeks before the election. Of course, those numbers aren't that different today than they were in October. The real reason is that deficits and the debt don't matter unless you're a Republican president. Actually, they do matter regardless of who is in the White House and which party controls Congress. You can find newspaper columns that wrote about this when Ronald Reagan, George Herbert Walker Bush, and Bill Clinton were president. You can even find Viewpoints commentaries I've written and recorded when George W. Bush and Barack Obama were president. Let's look at these last two presidents. When Bush came into office, the federal deficit was more than $5 trillion. When he left office and when President Obama took office, it was more than $10 trillion. And the federal debt today is almost $20 trillion. And if you want to blame Congress, both parties are to blame. During that time, Republicans controlled Congress some of the time, and Democrats controlled Congress at other times. So I welcome columnists who believe that deficits and the debt are important. I just wonder where they were when President Obama and Congress were running up more than $9 trillion in national debt. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For more information about issues covered on Viewpoints, visit pointofview.net. Pointofview.net.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Privileged to have with us today the historian Larry Schweikart, the politically incorrect guide to the presidents. And if you'd like to join us at any point, 1-800-351-1212. You know, Larry's went to the break. I was talking about the first full day of the Trump administration. Some people might say, well, wait a minute. He had half a day on Friday, and then he had full days on Saturday and Sunday. But those were taken up with different church services. As a matter of fact, it was great, I thought, to actually watch the church service that actually was broadcast on Saturday. There was a small one that was in St. John's, in which a good friend of ours, Robert Jeffress, was preaching. But it was even more interesting to me to then actually watch the one on Saturday, which was in the Washington Cathedral, which was much more ecumenical, but still we got a chance to see Greg Laurie pray and David Jeremiah pray and Jack Graham pray and a number of other individuals. So the really first full day was today. But while we talk about that, it's probably also interesting to remind ourselves that the oath of office you can find in Article 2 of the Constitution, but George Washington there in New York City added a few words, "So help me God," and also placed his hand on a Bible. And that established another one of those inaugural traditions, didn't it?
Yeah, the Bible incident is kind of funny in a couple of ways. Number one, they didn't have a Bible when they started to get to that point.
Yes.
You look around, it's like the best man forgetting to bring the ring, And so they looked around, and a guy ran over to the Masonic temple and brought back a Bible on a velvet pillow. Now, the fellow was short, but of course Washington is extremely tall for that age. He was 6'2" or 6'3", and just a giant of a man for that time. And so when the ceremony was done, the guy holds the Bible and he kind of lifts it up a little bit, and Washington looks at him like, what am I supposed to do? And he lifts it up even more, and no one knows what was in this guy's mind, but Washington bends down and kisses the Bible.
Kisses the Bible, yes.
Now,
we don't have that happening today, but everything else in terms of So Help Me God, putting your hand on a Bible and everything else has continued ever since that initial inauguration in 1789, hasn't it?
No, it has not. We have had two presidents who've sworn on a book of the law, not the Bible.
Oh, that's right. I'd forgotten that. Yes, yes.
And Teddy Roosevelt did not swear on anything. Those who know Roosevelt probably think he swore on himself, but, that's another story.
That is another story indeed. That's right. I'd forgotten that. And there are a few that have changed that, but still the tradition has generally been the case. That's a good point. Sure. While we were talking about George Washington opening his White House to let people in, it reminded me, some people have compared Donald Trump to Andrew Jackson, and Andrew Jackson opened the White House to the crowd, but in this case it tended to be pretty rowdy, didn't it? And so it turned into kind of a mob scene where they almost destroyed the president's house. Yeah. And a man who was a general who had fought in wars figured he better get out of there, and either went out the window or the door. It's different reports, and they drank heavily. They destroyed furniture in China. They ground cheese into the carpet with their boots. It was a mess after Andrew Jackson did that. So some of these inaugurations have been just a little bit rowdy, haven't they?
Well, let's remember that Washington did not have a White House. That
True.
Jefferson was the first president to go to the White House as we now know it. Jackson, of course, and I should mention, before Jackson, it's pretty much common for anybody to go in and out of the White House.
Isn't that amazing?
Jefferson would answer the White House door in his slippers and bathrobe himself. Lincoln ran the government with only two personal secretaries, and every day in Lincoln's term, and so this is 70 years after Washington. You still had lines of people inside the White House waiting to go into Lincoln's office every day to ask him for a job. So, but with Jackson, you're right. The crowd got a little unruly. They barged in. They emptied the liquor cabinets, and Jackson snuck out the back door and was seen later eating his evening meal by himself. Now, that alone is kind of astonishing that a president would go any place in a major city and be sitting there eating by himself these days. But, of course, they did not have a secret service, and that was not instituted until second or third year of Lincoln's term.
Well, let's if we can, we talked a little bit about, of course, Jefferson and others, but then we go to James Madison, and here's a problem, because then we are in the midst of the War of 1812, and in this case, not only did they have to leave, they actually look back and see that the White House is being burned by the British. Tell us a little bit more about that.
James Madison, he's one of the more unfortunate guys. It's hard to think of any president as unfortunate. Here's a guy who knew more about the Constitution, probably more about government than any human alive, and yet he turned out to be a pretty mediocre president. He was not forceful in his speech. He was a smaller guy. One biographer said that when he stood next to Hamilton, Hamilton was a peacock and Madison was a crow. And he has the unfortunate occurrence of having this group of war hawks come in, and Madison more or less has to just go along with the War of 1812. There's really no way he can stop it. So when the British invade and the American forces are routed at the Bladensburg races, the British advance onto Washington, and Madison gets out of the White House with Dolly, 20 or 30 minutes ahead of the incoming British, and they take, of course, the Gilbert Stuart painting of Washington with them. What I find most amazing about that story is after the British leave, Madison is trying to find the army, which has been scattered. He spends almost 3 full days in the saddle riding around Maryland trying to catch up with the army. And in the meantime, James Monroe, his Secretary of State, took over the job of president. Monroe was still Secretary of State, and the Secretary of War was gone someplace. Nobody could find him. So Monroe assumed the duties of Secretary of War. So here you had the next president acting as the current president's Secretary of State, Secretary of War all at once. Pretty astounding turn of events.
Which reminds me of something else. When we talk about the cabinet, of course, today we talked about the fact that there were 2 cabinet officers confirmed, probably a third today, so you'll have 3. But go back, say, 8 years ago, you had 8 confirmed for Barack Obama on his day of inauguration, 2 more, Hillary Clinton and Secretary of Transportation next day, so he had 10. But there was a time when, and you talk about this in George Washington and others in terms of developing a cabinet, you really just had 4. You had to have, of course, a Secretary of State because you had to deal with other countries. You had to have a Secretary of what today we call defense, but back then war, because you had to wage war. You needed a Secretary of Treasury, and then you needed somebody who maybe wasn't a secretary, but you needed somebody like the Attorney General. So you had to have a few. But even when you go back to, as you mentioned, James Madison, his Secretary of State became his Secretary of War because they couldn't find the other one. And so sometimes these individuals today had enormous amount of responsibility compared to how we've divided it today in our modern era.
And very small staffs. I think Hamilton ran the Treasury with 50 guys. Jefferson ran state with 20. But it's also interesting that these positions are not mentioned in the U.S. Constitution. And so Washington, right off the bat, has to make a decision. I'm going to need help. I'm going to need people I can really trust to do this. I'm going to have to allow the Senate to have a say in it, but I need them right now. So he appoints these people, and then he sends over their appointments to the Senate to be confirmed. And believe me, Washington intended they were to be confirmed. They were not to be debated or analyzed. It's merely a protocol. I am sending you the guy's name, but you're going to confirm him. And so
advice and consent was a little different back then, wasn't it?
Absolutely, yes.
We need to take a break, and we will probably skip a number of presidents. It would be fun to talk about James Monroe, who actually was the first one to give an inaugural address in front of a crowd. And, of course, we mentioned Andrew Jackson, but we'll jump back a little ahead to maybe Abraham Lincoln and a few of the others, just to give you a sense of some of the history that we have. Then I do want to pull off a little bit of the discussion on how Donald Trump won. Fascinating discussion there as well. Something that most of the pundits could not have imagined in their wildest dreams or worst nightmares, and that's exactly what we have here today. So if you'd like to join the conversation in this last half hour, we'll open up the phones. We're going to give you a little more history lesson and also look ahead to what we might expect in a Trump administration and find out a little bit more from Larry Schweikart how we can learn some of these lessons from history and apply them to what is happening today. Just a fascinating book, and if you'd like to know more about him or about these books that we're talking about today, we have a link to his website, which I would highly recommend that you go to, because as you go to patriotshistoryusa.com, you don't have to remember all that. It has a whole section on his books and teaching materials and all sorts of other great resources. So take the time to visit that on our website, pointofview.net. And as I mentioned before, we do have an Alaska tour, a cruise that will be taking place August 5th through the 12th, and we would love to have you join us. Penna Dexter, Kelly Shackelford, both will be with us with their families. We'd love to explore the wilds of Alaska, and we'd love to get to know you better. So take the time to click on that button, get a brochure, and pray about it. Hope you'll join us. We'll be back with more right after this.
Recently, I've been struggling through a case of what I call the cruds. Pretty common thing for most of us, but if you think about it, not a good thing for those who depend on our voice as part of our work. Kind of like someone who writes for a living suffering broken fingers. But we press on. We do the best we can as God provides, right? Well, that's what I'm asking you to do today. Not to feel guilty or stressed about what you can't do, but to step up and do what you can to support the Truth Team at Point of View. We'd love it if everyone could give $100 a month. If even a small percentage did that, we could greatly expand our impact. Or $65 to underwrite a minute each month. But for many, $1 a day, $30 is a stretch. As God provides, do what you can and help us change the future through changing minds and hearts 1 month at a time. Give online at pointofview.net or using the Point of View radio app, pointofview.net, or call 800-347-5151, 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Final half hour, if you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Larry Schweikart with us as we talk about this book, The Politically Incorrect Guide to the Presidents. And I thought we might focus a little bit of time on Abraham Lincoln, and oftentimes we know him for the Civil War, and of course we will talk about that. But anybody that's ever gone to a land-grant college, that goes back to the Land-Grant College Act, which was really an attempt to provide agriculture and engineering and technical education for the prairie states. And even to this day, you have various universities that have the words A&M on it, and you have the various state colleges and things of that nature that all really go back to Abraham Lincoln, don't they?
Yes, this is all part of the Republican plan, very much like some of the things Trump's advocating, by the way, in which you had the Homestead Act, which was to give away land to people to settle in the Midwest and the former Louisiana Purchase territory. And number two, to educate them, to make sure that they had access to, as you mentioned, agricultural, but also industrial, mechanical, mathematical, all sorts of other technical skills that they would need out on the prairie. And so, as you mentioned, there's it's not a hard and fast rule of thumb, but a number of colleges, if you see state in the word, in most cases, it's a land-grant college. If you see University of, it's the original state college. And, of course, one of the big exceptions to that is where I just came from here just 5 months ago, which is Ohio, where you have the Ohio State University. You always got to get that "the" in there.
That's right.
So that they aren't confused with a Morrell school. And then the third part of that was the railroads, the transcontinental railroads, which I do not think you needed government support to do. I could make a very good case you didn't need that at all. But nevertheless, the Republicans took advantage of basically controlling the government and passed that through. So you had transportation away for farmers to get goods to market. You had education services for them to get better at what they did. And then you had the land available to them. And so these Western states just blossomed after that.
So again, just a couple of things from the Lincoln administration. One of the others, and you talk about this, a rotation in officers in terms of the Civil War, but also has his cabinet. Anybody that has watched the movie Lincoln or read any books about Lincoln knows that he brought into his cabinet people that would be very disagreeable today in a typical cabinet, because it's kind of a philosophy that most presidents want everybody to hold hands around the cabinet table and sing Kumbaya. But Abraham Lincoln was willing to bring in individuals that were opponents, even if you will, enemies, to actually create a discussion and a debate that he felt was good for the formulation of various kinds of policies.
Yes, he did, and some of that was by necessity. We have to remember that Lincoln was not even listed on the program of Republican candidates who might win the nomination at the Chicago nominating convention. And he did not have the kinds of infrastructure support with the party that people like Horace Greeley had, or Sumner, or some of the other bigger name people that would eventually, some of them would serve in his cabinet. So he needed those guys. He didn't have a lot of other people to fall back on, and he did relish the exchange of ideas. Of course, he did also insist that they all write out their resignations and put them in his top drawer, so that if they ever got too far out of line, he said he'd fire the lot of them. And so they kind of straightened up after that.
What are some of the other lessons we can learn from Lincoln? Because he sort of changed this. Of course, after the Civil War, it used to be the United States of America. Of course, after the Civil War, it became the United States of America. And I use the emphasis deliberately, because before there was a sense in which some of that was almost like a confederation, in which the states were more important. After the Civil War, especially under Lincoln, it became the United States of America in a much more significant way, didn't it?
Sure, and probably the single most visible form of that is the 14th Amendment, that basically makes you a citizen of whatever state you reside in by virtue of the fact that you're a citizen of the United States first. Up to that point, you were a citizen of the United States because you were first and foremost a citizen of Virginia or Connecticut or wherever you came from. And by the way, your listeners would, I think, appreciate this. We've only had one president hold a patent.
Yes, and he's
and
the
that
one.
would be Abraham Lincoln for a device that lifted riverboats off of a barge, off of a sandbar.
So again, the first and only president so far that has a patent. And of course, then you have Andrew Johnson, I should say, and U.S. Grant and some other individuals. But let's, if we can, move up a little bit further to some of the modern times. You mentioned Teddy Roosevelt, and I thought it might be good to talk about how William McKinley dies. Teddy Roosevelt, probably the youngest president, I would suspect, And as a result, that is another individual we need to mention, because if you look at Mount Rushmore, you have George Washington, you have Thomas Jefferson, you have Abraham Lincoln, and you have Teddy Roosevelt. What about Teddy Roosevelt?
Right. Well, Teddy, let me mention this real quick since you threw his name out there. Ulysses Grant, you might be surprised to know that Ulysses Grant was the last president to own a slave. Wow. He had a slave in 1857 and set him free after that, but technically he was the last slave-owning president. Roosevelt, an amazing guy. Whether you agree with his policies or not, I don't think there's a person out there that would not want to be in a foxhole with Teddy Roosevelt. He loved America. He was a bigger-than-life guy. You know, Bram Stoker, the author of Dracula, once met him, and he said something like, "A stupendous individual must be president someday," you know. And another guy called him a brilliant madman born a century too soon. He was one of those figures that was just larger than life. He's serving as Assistant Secretary of the Navy when the Spanish-American War breaks out, and he resigns this cushy, safe job to go raise a volunteer regiment of cavalry to be thrown in harm's way. And, of course, he is awarded the Medal of Honor, making him the only president to be awarded both a Medal of Honor and a Nobel Peace Prize. He's chosen as McKinley's vice president largely to get him out of the way. He was a pain in the neck. And, you know, people thought, you know, let's please get this guy out of the way. And as fate would have it, McKinley's assassinated in Buffalo, New York. And once again, you have this situation, as you did with Garfield, where they know the bullet's in there, they can't find it. And you know, all these various infections and so forth develop, and he dies really from that because they can't ever extract the bullet. So Roosevelt becomes president. He becomes much more progressive than McKinley ever was. Mm-hmm. And I attribute a lot of his business policies, his antitrust and so forth, to the fact that of all the incredible things Roosevelt does, the one thing he never does is run a business. And I think if he had ever, which he could have done, if he had run a business, I think you would not have seen nearly as many progressive business things passed under him as were. I think he would have had a different attitude. But, you know, you can't do everything. Even Teddy Roosevelt couldn't do everything.
Again, larger than life. But again, just as you point out, of course, you mentioned the Trustbusters, but something else, which I did not know till I read your book, first president to travel abroad while in office, because he was going to Panama and, of course, building the Panama Canal, and there's a picture of him sitting on a giant steam shovel, you know, digging the canal. But we, again, take for granted that a sitting president would travel abroad, and yet he was the first, interestingly enough, who's just kind of into the early part of the 20th century, the very first president to travel abroad. Of course, now with modern transportation, we couldn't imagine any of the presidents, recent presidents, not traveling to many countries and conferences, but he was the first, and that was just really at the turn of the 20th century, wasn't it?
Well, you know, many of them had not traveled abroad ever, even obviously as president, but now the Adamses, who were diplomats, did, but many of them didn't ever travel abroad. Madison was the first president to go outside of his capital area, whether it was Philadelphia, New York, or D.C. He visited one place in the north and one place in the south. Monroe is the first one to ever really try to tour all the states. I don't think he gets to every state, but he gets to pretty much every region. And back in that day, that was something, because you're traveling with coaches and a little cavalry escort, you know, and it's quite a big deal. So some of the things that we think are just norm or par for the course today were quite revolutionary for some of these earlier guys.
Well, let's take a break, and when we come back, we'll talk a little bit about how Trump won. We have actually just taken you through the first part of the book. It goes from George Washington to William Howard Taft. Part two, from Woodrow Wilson to Barack Obama, actually is written by a different author, and we'll talk about that sometime in the future. But Larry, if you don't mind, when we come back from break, I want to talk a little bit about how Trump won and point people to that as well. So lots of things to talk about. And again, you can sit back and listen, but if you'd like to join the conversation, you are free to do that as well. 1-800-351-1212. We have a lot more information about Larry Schweikart on our website, pointofview.net, and I would encourage you not only to consider getting this book, but some of the others that I have on my shelf of interviews we've done with him in the past. We'll be back with more right after this.
Welcome to the First Liberty Briefing. I'm Jeremy Dice. After World War II, soldiers from the Army's 10th Mountain Division sought to honor their fallen brothers who were lost while fighting in some of the roughest terrain in Europe. The memorial is a 6-foot-tall figure of Jesus in the style of religious shrines they had seen on battlefields in Europe. The Knights of Columbus in Kalispell, Montana erected this Veterans Memorial known casually as Big Mountain Jesus. It stood without complaint for more than 60 years atop Big Mountain in the Flathead National Forest. One group wanted to knock the memorial down. They sued the U.S. Forest Service for permitting its presence on top of Big Mountain. First Liberty Institute filed a friend of the court brief on behalf of the state of Montana and the roughly 2.4 million members of the American Legion. We asked the court to preserve the 10th Mountain Division Veterans Memorial. The United States Court of Appeals for the Ninth Circuit held that the memorial is constitutional. The court explained that the Constitution does not require the government to purge cultural or historic symbols from the public square merely because they are religious. Veterans should be given wide latitude in determining how they choose to honor their fallen brothers in arms. And if these veterans choose religious symbolism as part of their memorials, the government's response should be one of respectful neutrality. To learn how First Liberty is protecting religious liberty for all Americans, visit firstliberty.org.
I'm Kelly Shackelford, President and Chief Counsel of First Liberty Institute. Some people think our religious freedom will soon be gone, but that's not true. The fact is that First Liberty, a national network of America's top attorneys, is winning over 90% of our cases. We defend religious freedom for people like you. Go to firstliberty.org and read the exciting story. That's firstliberty.org.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, if you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Larry, if I can, for just a minute, talk about how Trump won. You've been following that for some time, and it is great to have an individual who has a historical background, but also has been able to apply that to a contemporary issue like the election of Donald Trump.
Well, I predicted, I'd say fairly early, August 2015, that I thought Trump would win with, quote, between 300 and 320 electoral votes. I based that on where his constituencies were and who was responding to Trump. Later, by mid-2016, I was working with a group that, in the book we called the Renegade Deplorables, a group of pollsters and just stats guys, all volunteer, feeding information to the Trump campaign, all off the charts, off the books. And what we were finding was pretty astounding. Without going into the details, we had Ohio locked up for Trump long before October. And it turns out we were low. We were thinking 4 or 5%, and he won Ohio by 9%. We had Florida and North Carolina pretty well locked up, and we were a little bit high, but nevertheless, both of those came in with pretty solid margins. Where we were different than almost anybody else was we were saying there's tremendous strength for Trump in Pennsylvania and Michigan. And full disclosure, none of us called Wisconsin. Nobody got Wisconsin.
Nobody got that one. Yeah, that's right.
We did see a lot of strength. And I was working with a pollster out of Michigan who was telling me about a couple of counties there. And one of the things he said was, I went to a rally here in Macon County. He said, I've never seen so many union people at a Republican rally. He said it was mind-blowing. And so one of our guys was a pollster People's Pundit Daily pollster, Richard Barris, and he was keeping us apprised of his very latest polls. He goes, look, the averages are here, but he says the trend line is here, and he says Trump is gaining rapidly in Pennsylvania and Michigan, and he said our very last polls had him leading in both those states. And so on election night, I was in a back Twitter room. I couldn't stay on Twitter because everybody was bugging me. Oh, what's going to happen? Oh, this is terrible. Oh, he's going to lose. And I was in this back Twitter room with Barris and a couple of other guys, and Barris had some exit polls coming in. He goes, he's going to win Michigan. He's going to win Pennsylvania. And he called Pennsylvania 3 hours before the networks. He called Florida 1 hour before the networks. So I'd say that our work proved to be pretty on the spot.
Well, and again, a lot of that has to do with you looking at some of those Midwestern states. Now, again, nobody predicted Wisconsin, and when he won Wisconsin, I said, it is definitely over. I was thinking, as soon as I knew that he kept North Carolina and Florida and things like that, I figured it was maybe over. But nobody saw Wisconsin. But you were looking at places like Michigan and Pennsylvania, and we could play, if I had the time and inclination, some of the comments even made that night about, well, this is definitely a blue state, and it will definitely go for Hillary Clinton. So some of this had to do with some of the ability that you had and others to look at some of those Midwestern states and turn some of those areas and those counties, including ultimately a state which had been labeled a blue state and a blue wall, to actually go red and be able to elect Donald Trump. So again, those are very significant insights.
Here's a couple of just staggering numbers. Trump won Ohio by so many votes. He would have beaten Barack Obama in 2012 in Ohio. He would have beaten Barack Obama in Florida with his 2012 numbers. Now, Hillary would have exceeded Obama's number in Florida, but that's still two pretty shocking numbers there. And then how about this one? You talk about 2012, a difference of about 450,000 votes swung 5 states and the election to Barack Obama. In this election, 750,000 votes would have given Trump 7 more states, including Minnesota, New Hampshire, Maine, New Mexico, Colorado, Nevada, and this would have amounted to another 70 electoral votes. You're pushing 400 electoral votes. So that is crushing. So that's, people say, well, how close this was that Hillary won the popular vote. Yeah. Let's turn that on the other side. How close this was that Trump could have had an astounding blowout.
Well, I've never heard that number, so that's interesting. Let me take at least a phone call or two. We'll go to Harold. I think I'd love to give you a chance to express your opinion, and you're on with Larry Schweikart.
Yes, I'm Harold. I'm from Georgia, and I watch the game Survivor on Wednesday night on CBS shows. And after my church service. And I learned a real good technique, but it's kind of underhanded, but it's real good. And it taught me to watch people and read their body language. And these people do this on their show. And they come in, it's called backdooring them. And when they backdoor them, they slightly change their mind at the last minute to vote against this person to get them off their show. And it's pretty interesting on how that works. I believe they've really been watching a lot of Survivor in America to really see that this is the way we're going to survive in America, is to turn around and say, we don't need abortion, which we don't. And that was my deciding vote for Trump, because he actually stood up against it, and he said that she would go to jail.
Well, that's interesting. What about that? How many do you estimate, Larry, were late breaking votes, like he just talked about in Survivor here, where they hadn't made up their mind? Or was it that they had made up their mind, but they just weren't going to tell the pollsters because it was politically incorrect to say you're supporting Donald Trump?
Well, two things. There's a couple of news stories out here in the last days. I think People's Pundit Daily actually has one of them about the shy Trump voter, showing that, in fact, there were an awful lot of these people. And then Barris's exit polls were showing a massive late break toward Trump. For example, in Minnesota, outside of Minneapolis, Trump won Election Day in Minnesota, 2-1, 2-1. He lost the state because of early voting, and of course, a lot of the early voting was swayed by the sex tape that came out We found that, in fact, the sex tape probably cost him New Hampshire. That without that tape, he takes New Hampshire. Maybe Virginia is much more in play. Yeah, I think what your caller says is exactly right.
Well, again, a couple of key books. One, of course, we just mentioned in here just real quickly, but it's one that we can maybe talk more about in the future, How Trump Won. But the one that we have featured in the first part of this hour, The Politically Incorrect Guide to the President's Part 1. Of course, we'll get into Part 2 in the future with the other author. And Larry, it's just always been great to have you on the program. I certainly have appreciated your Patriots history of the United States. And, of course, I certainly remember the 7 events that made America America. So a couple of great resources. Also, I might mention your 48 Liberal Lies from American History. So many others that people can get a copy of. And we have a link to your website. So, as always, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Thank you very much, Kerby.
We're going to take a break. And then when we come back tomorrow, you know, we got quite a bit to talk about. I didn't even list all of the executive orders that have been signed by Donald Trump. One of the obvious ones was to begin the repeal and replace of Obamacare. That one we sort of mentioned the other day, so we'll get into that in a little more detail. Tomorrow, we hope to have Franklin Graham in studio with us, as well as with Dr. Kent Brantley. New film coming out in March called Facing Darkness, so we hope to have them in studio with us. And if you have a comment or question, you can certainly join with them, and we'll give you an update on that. We have our Millennial Roundtable taking place after that on Wednesday, and then we'll spend some time a little bit later in the week talking about some of the other issues that need to be addressed. And so, of course, then we'll finish with our Friday Roundtable. So lots of things that take place here on Point of View every day. Hope you'll make sure that you listen to it. And as you find maybe some of this of interest, you might take some of the articles and post them. Even go to our Facebook page and find some of those articles, or watch us again on the YouTube channel. I want to thank Andrew, Catherine, and Shamila for their help behind the scenes. We'll see you back here tomorrow right here on Point of View.
Why does Kerby Anderson do what he does? Because he believes in God's ability to use you to make a difference.
There's a real need for us to articulate a responsible biblical perspective and to give people an understanding of what is happening in the world, and in addition to educating them, to then empower them to go out and make a difference for Christ.
Together we can push back the growing darkness. It's not going to be easy. But by God's grace, it is happening, one person, one community at a time. Join us in this mission. Become a monthly partner. $1 a day, $30 a month will make a huge difference. Or perhaps you can do $100 a month. We need partners of all sizes. We need you. Give today online at pointofview.net. At the top of the page, next to the Donate Now button, click on Become a Monthly Partner. Pointofview.net. Mail your donation to Point of View, Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221, or call 800-347-5151. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.
I just thank God for y'all. I listen to you every day, truly. I wanted to thank y'all for everything you do each day to inform Christian families and our community about the things we can do, and just the way you're so informative. I listen to you daily and love you guys and appreciate you so much.
God bless you, Kerby, for keeping this show so on track and for the decades of wonderful help to this nation that Point of View has been. We're all big fans of your work, and we pray that God will just prosper it.
As a Christian, over the years that I've followed this program, I am constantly challenged to be on guard and to evaluate what's going on. And if for no other reason, to protect the caliber and the truth of your programming, I need to participate and to back your program financially to ensure that the truth stays out there for people to hear, to view, and to be a part of.
This is Point of View Radio.